Hello, welcome to a video lecture that I've prepared for you on rhetoric. What is it, and what does it have to do with this class? So, a lot of times when I ask students if they've encountered the term rhetoric before, they give me several different responses. One is that maybe they've heard it in terms of a rhetorical question, and I'll ask them, what is a rhetorical question? And sometimes I get the answer that a rhetorical question is a question for which there is no answer, which is not exactly correct. So, a rhetorical question actually is a statement, a point that's being made, but it's just phrased in the form of a question. So, if someone were to say, besides, who in their right mind would do that anyway? They're not really looking for an answer to that question. They're trying to make a point that no one in their right mind would do that. So, but instead of phrasing it as a declarative statement, they phrased it as a question instead. I've also heard students tell me that they encounter the term rhetoric in political situations. Politicians might say, that's mere rhetoric, or that's just a bunch of rhetoric. And actually, when they do that, they're engaging in the practice of rhetoric, in putting down rhetoric. So, but we haven't even defined what rhetoric is yet, so let's move along and see if we can discuss this a bit more at length. Okay, the study of rhetoric dates back to ancient Greek and Roman times. It's about as old as the study of philosophy and has a lot of parallels with the study of philosophy. Both rhetoricians and philosophers have attempted to use their field, their discipline, to search for truth and knowledge in things. And the most famous philosopher back in the day was Plato, and the followers were called Platonists, and they believed that truth was something absolute, that we actually experienced absolute truth before we were born, but somehow in the process of being born, we forgot everything that we knew in that sublime state before, and so we were trying to get back to that. And so truth is out there. Truth can be known if we could only think about it logically enough and eliminate distractions. So they would frequently isolate themselves, go for walks outside the city walls, and think about these philosophical issues very deeply by themselves. On the flip side, people who practiced rhetoric at that time, there were a group of people known as the sophists. And the sophists we would think about as like modern day lawyers. But the difference was, back in the day, you couldn't, if you got hauled into court for something, you couldn't bring a lawyer in to represent you. You had to be able to represent yourself. So the sophists would practice their rhetorical skills in public, in front of a crowd, within the city walls, and they would try to convince people to see things one way, and sometimes they'd turn around and try to convince them to see it the other way as well. And so you can see that if you can use something two different ways, sometimes people say, well, you know, what's the point? It's not getting us anywhere. But the sophists would subsequently, you know, like charge for their skills, that someone could hire them to teach them some rhetorical skills in case they were ever in a legal situation and had to defend themselves. But the most famous among the sophists was a person by the name of Gorgias. Gorgias was actually the richest man in ancient Greece. He was the best at rhetoric, and so therefore he could charge the most, and he was in high demand. And also these sophists tended to kind of move around quite a bit, didn't stay in one place, and so they were kind of hard to track down by the tax collectors. So, but by practicing in front of a crowd, their point was that truth is negotiable. In fact, Gorgias, kind of in response to the Platonists, famously said one time, he had a three-part statement. He said, "Nothing exists. If it did exist, how could we know it? And if we could know it, how could we relate it to anyone else?" And Gorgias didn't actually believe that nothing exists, but he said that to make a point that if truth is absolute, the only way we can know it is through language, and the only way we can relate it to anyone else is through language. And language is a rhetorical device, and the words never equal the experience. They're always somewhat removed from it. So if the word equaled the thing, we'd only need one language worldwide, but we have numerous languages worldwide. So there's not a one-to-one relationship between the word and the experience, or especially when we're not even talking about observable experiences, we're just talking about concepts, things that we can't even touch, that there's a disconnect. And so frequently you have to talk our way around things, and Gorgias is saying, we can't actually know absolute truth, and even if we could, we couldn't relate it to anyone else. We are stuck in a rhetorical paradigm, and so we have to employ rhetoric to help us see things and realize things. Okay, so moving on. Down at the bottom of the right-hand column, I said that Plato criticized rhetoric. He said rhetoric is just a craft, and he likened it to cooking. And the word that he used to describe it was techne, T-E-C-H-N-E, and so kind of like technique. And he said it wasn't a true art, and by true art, he meant that it couldn't be used for the exploration of truth and knowledge. He said philosophy is a true art, and anything that can be used for the exploration of truth and knowledge can be called epistemic. Epistemology is the study of the creation of truth and knowledge. So a very clear division between these two camps, and the history of rhetoric and the history of philosophy have paralleled each other, and there's oftentimes been some tension back and forth between the two. So the next major development in rhetoric, probably the actual first major development, is along comes Aristotle. Aristotle is Plato's student, and you would think he would fall in line with what his teacher says. But he wrote a work called On Rhetoric, and in the very first sentence of On Rhetoric, he said, "Rhetoric is the natural counterpart to dialectic." Dialectic being another word for philosophy. So in one breath, in the very first sentence, he said rhetoric is epistemic too. He didn't say rhetoric was better than philosophy, but he said they are both methods for exploring truth and knowledge, and they work differently, but they can be used effectively together. And I think more than anything, one of the things that Aristotle was saying was that philosophers tend to rely mainly on logic to pursue things, and we're going to see here in a little bit that there are other methods, other appeals that we can use to pursue things as well. So Aristotle also defined rhetoric in his book On Rhetoric. He said the art of finding the available means of persuasion in any given situation. So a couple of words there I underlined for you. Persuasion, a lot of people think of rhetoric as the art of persuasion, and I think that's a good definition in shorthand, or the art of argumentation. I think that sometimes people see the word persuasion as someone trying to convince them to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do, and so they're just trustful of it. But persuasion is all around us all the time. Advertising, politics, everything is persuasive on some level. And then situation, Aristotle also defined the rhetorical situation. Very simple formula, audience plus purpose. It's been expanded upon since then. The most lasting thing has been context has been added to it. But with these different assignments that we're doing, I'm defining your purpose for you. Typically, based on our purpose, we'll pick a particular mode of communication, such as an essay or a letter or an email or something like that. So I'm defining your purpose for you. And oftentimes I'm defining your audience for you. But in terms of audience and purpose, we have to pay particular attention to audience at all times. Who is our audience? What do we know about them? What do they value? How can we appeal to their beliefs and values? And so, based on audience, Aristotle, in this same work on rhetoric, went on to define the rhetorical appeals. And he came up with three of them: ethos, pathos, and logos. Sometimes you hear them pronounced pathos or logos or something, but I tend to pronounce them all with a long vowel sound at the end: ethos, pathos, and logos. And the rhetorical appeals, ethos is an appeal to ethics or authority. So if you kind of squint your eyes a little bit and look at that, you might see ethics emerging out of it, or change the E to an AU and you get author, authority out of that. So ethos is an appeal to ethics or authority. Pathos, if you squint your eyes and look at that, you might see pathetic emerging out of it. Pathetic is an emotional word. There are other words that use path in them: empathy, sympathy. So pathos is an appeal to the emotions. Logos, if you look at that, you can easily see logic emerging out of that. So logos is an appeal to logic or reasoning. And in fact, philosophers tried to focus exclusively on logos in their pursuit of absolute truth. And Aristotle is saying, you might be able to do that, but as humans, we are also susceptible to our emotions and our sense of morality, right and wrong. And so we can't disregard ethos and pathos. And in fact, over the years, many studies have been done on the effectiveness of ethos, pathos, and logos. And all three tend to be present in any given document, any given text, but one tends to dominate, and depending on the situation. And but in all types of situations, rhetorical studies have found that the most effective is actually pathos, emotions. So we are frequently ruled by our emotions. And then second in effectiveness is ethos. And then thirdly in effectiveness is logos. So sometimes we try to think that we're making logical decisions about things, but to truly make a logical decision, you need to be kind of dispassionate at the beginning, open to either yes or no as you look at your decision. But what typically happens a lot of times, let's say you're standing in line at Starbucks and you're looking at all those pastries in the counter, we tend to make decisions that appear to be justified, but are actually, we're justifying them after the fact. We're acting our emotions. And so we're saying, I'm going to have that lemon poppy seed cake because I'm going to work out later or something. So we act emotionally, and instead of justifying it logically, the process is instead called rationalizing. Rationalizing is something we do after the fact to make us feel good about the decision that we may have already made already, probably based largely on emotion. So all three of these are present at any given time in any document, but one tends to dominate depending on the situation. And I'm not sure if I skipped over a term here. I meant to give another one to you. Whoops. Okay. The fourth term that I wanted to give to you is called kairos, K-A-I-R-O-S, and does not have a one-to-one translation into English, but the closest translation is appropriateness. So depending on the situation, which would be the most appropriate rhetorical appeal to use? Which one should we try to emphasize more or less? So kairos is kind of a governing principle for rhetoric. Okay. So moving on, the rhetorical canons, so to speak, are things that rhetoric should be concerned with. So we have invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And invention does mean epistemology. Arrangement and style are kind of, how we put things together. Memory, historically, that rhetoricians memorize their speeches, But now we see writing as an aid to memory, so we can still add memory in there. And then delivery, how it's presented and everything. And so these are the 5 canons of rhetoric. Over the years, the evolution of rhetoric continued, with rhetoric experiencing upsurges in popularity and downward trends in popularity. And one of the most famous or infamous came during the Middle Ages, when a French philosopher by the name of Peter Ramus, or Petrus Ramus, basically said that rhetoric has nothing to do with invention and therefore is not epistemic. So in terms of the canons of rhetoric, invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery, he said rhetoric concerns itself merely with style and arrangement, or what he called composition. And so today, the term composition that we call first-year writing gets its name directly from Peter Ramus. And personally, I kind of object to it. I refer to my field as rhetoric and composition instead of composition and rhetoric. But the term composition owes its origins to Peter Ramus in terms of the English classroom. So rhetoric continued to evolve over the years. There was the so-called elocutionary movement, and here's kind of a depiction of some of that. So rhetoric kind of, I think as I say in my third bullet point item there, kept alive in speech departments. It kind of went back and forth between sometimes being the focus of English departments and sometimes the focus of these speech departments. So what we're seeing here is kind of more like what you would find in a speech department. In the English classroom, and this is probably a grade school, what we had was called current traditional rhetoric, and it still pervades to this day. What current traditional rhetoric is an emphasis on correctness, spelling, grammar, punctuation, all the rules of writing. And basically a lot of these rules of writing, which today we found kind of get in the way of writing, they were being emphasized. It's oftentimes the easiest part of writing to teach: proper spelling, grammar, punctuation. And oftentimes students who had things to say but just didn't know all of these rules of writing, they were suffering the worst because they couldn't get their ideas out and down on paper because they were being criticized for their correctness all the time. So thankfully, by about the 1960s, English departments reclaimed rhetoric. They threw off the current traditional approach to rhetoric and focused more on what's called a process approach to writing. It's referred to in English circles as the process movement. And so over here on the right-hand side, we can kind of see some representations of the writing process. And even you see that in all of these models, we don't get just to a stopping point where it's done. Even a final draft is always subject to revision and rewriting, and the paper you write for this class can be rewritten. It'd have to be substantially rewritten, but maybe for an upper division class later on. So ideas are always in the process of evolving, and a final draft is just kind of a temporary stabilization of your ideas, but it's not supposed to be the end, so to speak. So, so with this process movement, the focus is getting your ideas out, getting them down on paper, and working with those. And then the closer and closer we get to the final draft, then we bring in concerns about spelling, grammar, punctuation, and the mechanics of writing. So getting your ideas out, getting them down on paper, and throwing your ideas out in this social milieu of ideas is a return to an epistemic quality in rhetoric. We call it the social epistemic, also sometimes referred to as social constructivism. So the reason we argue about these things is because we have to, in order to come to some sort of agreement about things, because language is always elusive, and we have to keep talking about these things over and over again. Okay, so what does rhetoric have to do with this class? Basically, everything that we're doing in this class is rhetorical. We're trying to influence, persuade, um, communicate. I will frequently use the terms ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos throughout the semester, so make sure you're familiar with them. Audience concerns are paramount in all of your writing situations, so think about your audience. Try to respond to audience concerns, and by creating these different narratives, for instance, on the first essay, and putting them out there, we are engaging in a social constructivist practice. So rhetoric ties in with all of that. Okay, so I think that's about all I have on some backgrounds about rhetoric today, but they do inform everything that I do in teaching writing, and um, I'm sure I'll be in touch with you later for another lecture. So thanks for listening.